All right, let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the HNRCA Monday Seminar Series. It's great to have everyone back this week after our state holiday last week. For today, we are very excited to welcome our speaker who is previously of the HNRCA, actually. Our invited speaker today is Dr. Katherine Tucker, professor in the Department of Biomedical and Nutritional Sciences and director of the Center for Population Health at UMass Lowell. Dr. Tucker has extensive experience in nutritional epidemiology related to diet and chronic diseases, including the study of health disparities. She has an extensive publication record and also serves as editor-in-chief of Advances in Nutrition. Dr. Tucker is PI of the Boston Puerto Rican Health Study, which we are very excited to hear more about today. So after the presentation, we'll have time for questions, and I encourage you to use the raised hand feature on Zoom to ask your questions live. Dr. Tucker would love to hear your voices and your questions. So I'd like to now welcome our speaker, Dr. Tucker.
Thank you so much. It's really very nice to be here virtually with my friends at the HNRC. What I've been asked to do is talk about our study, which started there, the Boston Puerto Rican Health Study. I was just putting this together and realizing it's been 30 years of work that I'm going to try and summarize. So obviously I can only include certain things, but I hope this gives you an overview of the path we've taken and where we are going with this study. So first of all, the question I always got was why Puerto Ricans? Why are we looking at Puerto Ricans? Well, as we know, Hispanics are the largest minority group in the US, and they're growing in number. And Puerto Ricans are the second largest Hispanic group and the largest in the Northeast part of the region of the country. And when I got started on this, there was virtually no information, very little information available separating out different Hispanic subgroups. Most of the data that were available were for Mexican Americans. So the one thing that was available was the National Health Interview Survey. And this illustrated something very important. One, that Latino groups are not all the same. As you can see here, the Mexican Americans are in black and blue, and Puerto Ricans in yellow. And Puerto Ricans have more diabetes, more heart disease, more hypertension, and much more asthma and COPD than the other groups. They have greater health disparities than the Mexican Americans. So given that there was literally nothing to really get this started, we started out first with a cross-sectional study across the state of Massachusetts, trying to be representative of the Latino older adults in the state, using a sampling proportional to size, and identified non-Hispanic whites in the same neighborhood to kind of document these health disparities. If we used a general group of whites, we knew there would be a lot of difference, but we wanted people with the same environment. So, oops, I skipped by that. So to get started, when you're working with a new group, you always have to do a lot of groundwork. You can't just knock on doors. So we started out with a tremendous help from a community center, La Alianza Hispana, who helped us publicize this study and helped us develop and test our questionnaires. The first obvious issue was dietary assessment. The Puerto Rican diet is quite different from the usual North American diet, and food frequency questionnaires that existed were not going to work. They were missing foods like plantains, and the portion sizes were completely wrong for things like rice and other kinds of root crops that they use. one of the things that we really found diving deep into this was that recipes matter a lot, and that's something underappreciated in food frequency questionnaires. For example, Puerto Ricans always cook their rice with oil, whereas the Block and Willett assume you cook your rice without oil. So that's a lot of fat that would be missing if you didn't have that knowledge. Also, coffee. They drink half milk and half coffee frequently. So it's a lot more milk than you would be getting if you didn't know that. And they also cook with sofrito and a vegetable seasoning that would miss a lot of peppers and onions and things like that if you didn't know. So we worked very hard on this. We compared, we did food ranking to identify the major food contributors to nutrients. Fortunately, happily, we had available an old data set, the single time that they did a Hispanic Hanes. It was from the 1970s, but it did have things separated by Hispanic subgroups. So we were able to do the food ranking and get the major food contributors for Puerto Ricans. We also compared portion size for every line item, comparing the Hispanic Hanes Puerto Ricans to the Hanes 3 portion sizes. And what you can see here is just one example. Chicken soup, the mode for Hanes 3 is about 200 grams or a cup of soup. But for Puerto Ricans, if they have chicken soup, it's a main meal, and it's usually with more content, and it's more than twice that size. So all of these things matter so much in getting accurate diet on a subgroup within a population. This is an example of how we tested it, comparing to 24-hour recall. If we use we started out with a block questionnaire, and if we had just used the original block, we would have seen a significant difference in folate intake between the non-Hispanic whites and the Hispanics. But with the recalls, there was no such difference. And so once we revised with new foods and added expanded portion sizes, we were able to get back to the true comparison. So here's just a quick overview of what we found to document these health disparities. They really pretty much mirrored what we saw in the National Health Interview Survey, that the Puerto Ricans and Dominicans living in Massachusetts have significantly more hypertension, twice the diabetes, almost 40% at that time. Excuse me, I have a bit of a cough, so I may interrupt a few times. But one of the things that we weren't focused on, but surprised us, was the high rate of depressive symptomatology, much higher in the Puerto Ricans than other groups. And we've come to see that that's a really important health disparity. Another thing that stood out in the Massachusetts Hispanic Elders study was the proportion with low vitamin B6. Here you can see that 42% had less than 35 nanomoles per liter, which might be borderline, and 16% had less than 20, which is pretty clear deficiency. But it wasn't only the Hispanics, the non-Hispanic white elders in these low-income neighborhoods also had low B6. And going back to the depression, what we found was that vitamin B6, if it was low, there was 3 times the likelihood of having depressive symptoms that were meaningful. And even after full adjustment for diet, lifestyle education, Framingham risk score, it still remained almost twice as likely. Very strong association between vitamin B6 and depression. We're gonna hear a lot more about B6 in this as we move forward, but having that representative cross-section of Latinos in Massachusetts set us up perfectly. It was just serendipitous timing that there was a call for population health and health disparities centers. And we were we had the preliminary data to propose that we would focus not on all Latinos, but on the majority group, Puerto Ricans, in a longitudinal study to really tease out what were the causes of some of these health disparities. So we were funded for the first 5 years by the National Institute on Aging. And our overall aim was to examine relationships between stress. That was part of the call for health disparities. It was one of the issues they were interested in. And physiological response to stress, which is called allostatic load, and physical and cognitive aging. And our specific aims were then to examine the roles of nutrition, social support, and genetics in the modification of these associations. So it was a big umbrella aim that had a lot of different pieces in it. And one of the great things was that being funded by the Centers for Population Health, we had annual meetings with all the other centers for population health and exchanged ideas and compared data. And together we came up with this framework for multi-level research in health disparities. As you can see, it's quite complicated. It involves multiple layers, starting with social conditions, public policy, discrimination, prejudice, institutions, social relationships, the physical environment, all these what they call downstream factors that set the stage for health disparities that are important to examine to see if we can change some of these situations to improve health in vulnerable groups. And then we get back into what's more familiar territory with individual characteristics and risk factors. So I'm going to continue on just to say that we got our next 5 years funded after the first 5 years. Unfortunately, the National Institute of Aging did not go in for the second call for population health and health disparities centers. So we had to retool, and we did that to focus on heart disease, and were funded the second time by NHLBI. So in our first group, we had two waves of data, and then our third wave of data, we removed the physical and cognitive aging and replaced it with heart disease factors, and we included more of that psychosocial, environmental context, discrimination, and poverty in our broader health disparities framework. So here's where we are. Our baseline was from 2005 to 2009. We identified about 1,500 participants, and we had repeated measures at 2 time points for physical and cognitive function, depressive symptoms, health status, medications, lifestyle, diet, stress, networks, anthropometry. We had many biomarkers, vitamins, CRP, stress markers as part of allostatic load, lipids, glucose, and fatty acids. We did not have GWAS and metabolomics at that time. We added them later, but they were from the baseline measures. So after those baseline measures, we had a 2-year follow-up within that PO1, but we also got another R01 to examine bone mineral density with Best, Dawson, Hughes here. And so we repeated our measures at time 2, but we also added DEXA measures to get bone mineral density. Our second center grant, the P50, focused on heart disease. So we added pulse pressure, ankle brachial index, and Framingham risk score, neighborhood and physical environment. And we had a sub-project on air pollution with Doug Brugge from Tufts Medical School. Currently, we're finishing up 2 follow-up R01s that gave us a 4th wave. And so at one of those is funded to look at cognitive decline and allowed us to do MRIs on about 150 of our participants. And another one was to do follow-up on bone. So we have just finished the data collection on the bone, where we're looking at DEXA and bone quality, and we'll be able to see change in bone over time. So here's what our study sample looks like. Mean age of 58, we sampled from 45 to 75. Most were female. Almost 60% fell below the poverty line. 48% had less than 8th grade education. Interestingly, they've been in the United States for a long, long time, average of 30 years, but their acculturation score, where 0 is living in Spanish and 100 is living in English, was low at 24. A lot of them lived in communities where they were able to operate in Spanish. As you can see below, their health is not good. We have very high prevalence of obesity, waist circumference. 81% of women had high waist circumference. ADLs, activities of daily living, 76% reported at least one, some difficulty. 64% reported depressive symptomatology, more than we saw in the Mahe study. And 55% of women had low mini mental state exam. Men, a little bit better, but also quite high. So what is allostatic load? That was one of the centerpieces of our study. Well, it is the wear and tear that the body experiences due to repeated cycles of what's called allostasis or stress. And it eventually is a burnout of the body system. So a lack of adaptation and shutting off the responses. So in this figure, as an example, if you occasionally see a tiger in the woods, you would get scared and your blood pressure would go up and you'd have different metabolic responses. And then the tiger went away and you would calm down and everything would go back to normal. However, if you were living in constant threat of that tiger and every day you encountered it, eventually your blood pressure would go up and it won't come back down as much. And other markers like C-reactive protein and inflammation would go up and it wouldn't come fully back down. And so that's the theory of how we start developing some of these markers from stress damaging the body over time. So in our case, part of the health disparities groups, a lot of the different centers we're looking at this, is that some groups, especially living in urban areas, every time they go out, they may have fear of crime, they may have fear of not having enough money for food at the end of the month, and so many other things that are stressors, including discrimination. So here's this allostatic load variable is based on the MacArthur studies of aging, and we used the same markers that they did. And what you can see here is that, again, more indications of the poor health of this population. At the bottom, you'll see that in the MacArthur study, the medians were 2.6 for high functioning groups and 3.1 for low functioning groups. In our group, we had a median of 5 for women and 4 for men, so much higher allostatic load than in the non-Hispanic white group studied by the MacArthur studies. Interestingly, the things that were high within this score differed by sex. So women were most likely to have the cardiometabolic risk factors, including blood pressure, waist hip ratio, low HDL, and high glycosylated hemoglobin. You can see there's 76% had high glycosylated hemoglobin. Whereas the men, interestingly, had more of the stress markers like epinephrine, norepinephrine, and cortisol, and low DHEAS. But you can see there the cortisol was high for 70% of the men. So very different pattern. Now, one of our graduate students back at the HNRC, Josemir Mate, did her dissertation looking carefully at the allostatic load and taking out each particular component and using the remaining score. She showed that allostatic load was clearly associated with all these other things. So it really is a cluster of things going on together. And at the end, you'll see a clear dose response relationship with risk of cardiovascular disease. Another way of looking at the effects of allostatic load, this was done by Chow Lai, looking at two different scores, the MacArthur and Wisconsin score. Chow measured a DNA damage marker, 8-hydroxydeoxyguanine in urine, and showed that there was significant relationship with allostatic load and DNA damage. So that's an important thing to consider in terms of the effects of this stress on the body. Another student then looked at that 8-hydroxydeoxyguanine and chronic disease status. And you can see here, this is vitamin B6, PLP, with 8-hydroxydeoxyguanine, CRP, and chronic disease status. Going back to B6, we're going to come back to that frequently. And you can see a clear dose response with C-reactive protein. It is fairly well known that vitamin B6 and inflammation are related, but also with the DNA damage and significantly associated with having metabolic syndrome, obesity, and diabetes. Another analysis with vitamin B6, we looked at cognitive decline over the first 2 years and found significant association of having vitamin B6 or PLP less than 30 nanomoles per liter and executive function. Another nutritional indicator, we were fortunate to have our fatty acids analyzed in this group, and the omega-3 index, or the omega-3 fatty acids, were significantly associated with depression, protective against depression. So those are some of the individual nutrients, but many of you know that we like to study dietary patterns. The field has been moving strongly in that direction because all these individual nutrients interact and work together. So this is work by Sabrina Noel, a Ph.D. student who was there at the HNRC. And what we like to do sometimes, there are these standard scores like the Healthy Eating Index and Mediterranean Diet Score, which I'll get to later. But especially in non-typical or non-majority groups, we like to use principal components analysis to see different subgroups of food and food behavior, to see what people are actually eating, not only how they meet a pre-specified pattern. And we often find interesting things. In this case, we've got pretty much a Western diet for the first factor, but we have an interesting factor too, which is a traditional pattern of rice, beans, and oils. They're eating a lot of rice and beans, and they put the oils in the rice, and in this case, low and high-fat dairy. And then a sweets pattern came out as well. When we related this to metabolic syndrome, we found something somewhat surprising in that the traditional pattern was significantly associated with having metabolic syndrome. Now, this was of great interest because a lot of other work with Mexican Americans show that the more traditional patterns they maintain, the better their health, and that they get worse with time here and with generations moving towards fast food. But in this case, what's called the traditional pattern for Puerto Ricans was associated with higher risk. And there are many reasons for that, but two stand out. One, they have a lot of refined carbohydrates, a lot of white rice and a lot of white bread, and 2, very low variety. They may have had much more variety in fruits and vegetables and other things on the island, but here, what we see is very low variety in their diets, and we think that's a problem. The sweets pattern also was associated with metabolic syndrome, but we could only see it after looking at those without diabetes, which makes sense because some of those with diabetes probably have reduced some of their sweets intakes. The second factor analysis that Sabrina did is looking at fatty acids. And so here, what we found was that the N3 factor, again, very important factor, was very predictive of protection against metabolic syndrome, almost half the risk for those in the highest quintile of omega-3 intake. Now, this again is something that on the island of Puerto Rico, they would have had a lot more fish. Fish is very expensive, and fish intake was not high in this population. So these are targets for intervention. So that was looking at data-driven patterns. Shilpa Bupatharaju, another graduate student, looked at the American Heart Association lifestyle score. And again, what we're seeing here is how poor adherence is to this score. Only 13% met BMI recommendation, only 4 for physical activity, basically none for added sugars and salt or whole grains. And so this is clearly showing a lot of room for improvement. And when we related that diet and lifestyle score to CVD risk, what we see is clear associations, protection against high waist circumference, against high CRP, serum glucose, and insulin. So this shows that is a good score and something to strive for to improve health. The other aspect that Shilpa worked on is variety, because we did note such low variety in fruit and vegetable intake, mostly iceberg lettuce and tomatoes and very little else. And so what she did was looked at the comparison of total fruit and vegetable intake and then of fruit and vegetable variety. And very interestingly, what you can see here for C-reactive protein or inflammation is that there was no association with total fruit and vegetable intake. But when we looked at variety, it was very protective. That means that they were expanding beyond the basic fruits and vegetables and adding more variety, probably darker greens and other fruits that would help to be protective. So variety is an old tenet of nutrition, and it continues to be true. We then took that variety score and looked at cognitive function, and we're pretty surprised at how strong the relationship was. Here you see mini mental state, memory, executive function, and attention, all were significantly related to fruit and vegetable variety. We also looked at cognitive function with some of the most used scores, the Healthy Eating Index and the Mediterranean Diet Score. They were both associated, but as you can see, the Mediterranean Diet Score was strongly associated. And we find that in a lot of our analyses, the Mediterranean Diet Score stands out for this population as being helpful. Also, we looked at plasma folate and vitamin B12 in relation to cognitive function, and this looks very similar to earlier work that we had done with the normative aging study showing these vitamins related to cognitive function. But here, what you can see is that looking at a global cognitive score, there was pretty much a threshold for vitamin B12, where those below 235 picomoles per liter had significantly lower global cognitive function. So we know that B12 is very important. For folate, there was also a tendency to a threshold and then a progressive improvement, but the threshold was at about 35 nanomoles per liter. So these are two very important vitamins that we know can help many things, but certainly cognitive function. My current student is looking at a new nutrient. She worked in the lab and analyzed our blood samples for magnesium. And we were concerned to see that 46% fell into the category of hypomagnesemia. So magnesium seems to be a very, very important issue for this population. We looked into what were the factors associated with this low magnesium, and we did not see an association with diet, but what we see very clearly here is an association with diabetes. Those using metformin, almost 4 times the risk of low magnesium, and those using it for more than 5 years have almost 6 times the risk of low magnesium. This has been identified before, but this is really a strong association that needs more attention, because clearly these individuals, many of them have diabetes and many of them are taking these medications, and we don't know the full implications of this, but it seems to be quite important. Okay. The other aspect we were looking at in terms of modification is genetics. And we worked with Jose Ordovis and Chao Lai on this segment. Chao started out by doing population stratification in this group. Fascinating that you can see here that given the history of Puerto Rico, starting with native Taino Indians and then Europeans and Africans moving in, they're pretty much a blend of these 3 ancestries, with some standing out as more pure, but very few. And the dominant ancestry is associated with risk. Not surprisingly, we know that African Americans have higher risk of hypertension, and that was true here. The more African ancestry was associated with 3 times the risk. What was a little bit surprising, but we know that for example, Pima Indians have higher risk of cardiovascular disease, was that those with the native genes predominating had tremendously higher risk of cardiovascular disease. Now, Josimir Mate looked at risk of alleles that were related to lipid metabolism. There are certain alleles that are risk alleles and certain alleles that are protective alleles. And she compared our Puerto Rican group with a group of non-Hispanic whites and demonstrated that the Puerto Ricans have more risk alleles and fewer protective alleles, which automatically puts them at greater risk. So it can't be ignored that this genetic background does contribute to health disparities. And here, some pretty dramatic findings. Here's one example of ApoA genes, where if you look at the left, this is the common genotype. 70% carry the common genotype. And in a low-fat environment, which there would have been historically, that common genotype is protective. In this case, we're looking at waist circumference and blood pressure. But once you move into the high-fat intake environment, that common genotype, which affects the majority, becomes detrimental. And that's a lot of what we're seeing now, is that these genotypes that may have been helpful in conserving energy and body mass, historically in some of the most deprived groups now is having the opposite effect in our current environment of high energy, high fat diets. Another recent example of this that also is pretty dramatic. Here we're looking at transcription factor 7 like 2 genetic variants. These are variants that predispose individuals to diabetes. And what we're seeing here is that the Mediterranean diet is protective, so that those with these risk variants in the low Mediterranean diet have higher risk of obesity and high waist circumference. But those with high Mediterranean diet intakes are protected. This is so important because, like what we saw previously with fat, it's clear that these risks from genetic variants can be overcome in some cases with better diet. And we have so much more to learn about this and so much more to communicate about this to help people. Okay, well, that was a quick tour of some of our findings from our 2 program projects. Where we are now, well, we are finishing up 2 R01s. You'll see the consistent B6 pattern here. One was funded by Aging to look at processed foods. We are seeing a lot of concern with phosphorus additives in foods and how they may affect inflammation and vascular calcification. And vitamin B6, we think, is protective against these things. So that was our hypothesis. We have another round, a 3rd round of cognitive testing. And as I mentioned, MRIs for, I think we've got about 160 done. And here, as part of our preliminary data, we did see an association between a processed food score and and memory, and between vitamin B6 protective of both executive function and memory. Also recently, we've been looking at the metabolomics data we have from baseline. And this Natasha Palacios from UMass Lowell looked at those with cognition above, greater than 1 standard deviation above the mean, or greater than 1 standard deviation below the mean, and found distinct metabolite patterns. Here we see EPA as protective. Again, those omega-3s seem to be quite important. And on the downside, we see sucrose as being quite negative, along with these other metabolites. Taken together, these metabolomic variables can help us understand patterns of risk and sometimes metabolic pathways. So in terms of the MRIs, we brought our participants into Beth Israel Hospital, and they have a very sophisticated MRI system where we're able to look at brain structure, diffusion, and connectivity. And so we have only started to do analysis with this, but has a lot of potential to help us understand what's going on in the brains. This is our first publication showing that hippocampal volume is associated with mini mental state exam, particularly affected by hypertension and diabetes. And so those 3 shaded bars in the middle are first better deviance with neither of those conditions, moderate with one of the 2, and significantly poorer cognitive function with both. And this is compared on this graph with another cohort, the ADNI cohort, and shows that without our Puerto Rican adults without these 2 conditions are somewhere in between mild cognitive impairment and mild cognitive impairment and normal on the upside, and on the downside, they're between mild cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's disease. So it's following a logical pattern. On the right, what we see is we have calculated a score for brain age. Brain age is lower in our population than the ADNI cohort, and as was hippocampal volume and mini mental state exam. Another way of looking at this is with these patterns of colors that come out in terms of connectivity of white matter. And the more of these patterns there are, the difference there are between groups. And so on the left, what we're looking at is hypertension versus none. And on the right, what we're looking at is both hypertension and diabetes versus neither. And so you can see that hypertension is bad, but having the combination of both, it really takes a toll on the brain. And so this is just yet another reason to step up public health activities to reduce the incidence of hypertension and diabetes, because it's not just those diseases they have, but all the sequelae, including cognitive decline. Next, we have a network analysis, and this is something that's quite complicated. It's a multi-level analysis with some new software, but it allows us to put in a variety of indicators. And what's interesting here is that we looked at it by ApoE4 carriers and non-carriers. And basically what we're seeing is that the variables that we've measured are much more active in the ApoE4 carriers. This again reinforces that when you have certain risk alleles, some of that can be moderated by nutrition. And what stands out here are B vitamins, B6 and B12, and fatty acids, along with on the positive side, and then plasma lipids and clinical variables, phosphorus and cytokines. And to summarize this a little more, it isn't simple, but looking at direct connection to the brain, the strongest factor with the ApoE4 non-carriers was having diabetes and hypertension. But all these other factors were active in the carriers, including B vitamins, lipids, the fatty acids, and in particular, the N3 fatty acids, again, emphasizing that. And also the HEI, Healthy Eating Index diet score, again, focusing on how important a good diet is to keeping us healthy as we age in many things, but certainly in cognitive function. And on the right, what we have is a network analysis showing combinations of things, but showing that in the ApoE4 non-carriers, again, it was the hypertension and diabetes that was even worse with high creatinine. And in the ApoE carriers, it was C-reactive protein in combination with high creatinine that was quite bad. And also C-reactive protein in combination with high triglycerides. So the other R1 that we're finishing up right now with BESS is a second wave of bone mineral density measures. And for this one of the focuses is the interaction with type 2 diabetes, because we have so many individuals with type 2 diabetes. It's interesting that with type 2 diabetes, bone mineral density is often higher. And so it doesn't turn out to be a good marker of bone status, because although for some reason the type 2 diabetes has an effect that increases bone density, fracture rates are still higher. So it's got to be something with the bone quality. So in this case, we are looking at bone quality. We were measuring that with an osteoprobe. As Beth knows, we were interrupted a lot with COVID and osteoprobe permission from the FDA, but we've just finished measurement and we'll be starting on analysis soon. Our hypotheses are that type 2 diabetes increases age products and that decreases bone quality. But our old friend vitamin B6 is back here as well, that can reduce those age products and therefore increase bone quality. So we're looking forward to starting those analyses soon. But from our baseline bone, we did find some interesting things. One is that common knowledge, and it's stated even in some publications, is that African Americans or non-Hispanic Blacks have lower risk of osteoporosis. It used to be thought that, osteoporosis is a white woman's disease, and that Hispanics have in between status. However, when Sabrina Noel looked at the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey and compared it to our Puerto Rican population, what we found is that's not true. In fact, the Mexican American women had higher risk of osteoporosis than the non-Hispanic white women, and the Puerto Ricans have significant risk. But even more surprising was the men. As you can see here, we saw osteoporosis in almost 9% of our sample, whereas the non-Hispanic white man is only about 2%. So we have a lot of questions as to what's going on in terms of bone with the men in our study. And these are looking at diet and osteoporosis and comparing different scores, the DASH, the Mediterranean diet, and the alternate healthy eating index. And all of those were significant for postmenopausal women, but the strongest association was with DASH, which we think is logical given that DASH emphasizes dairy products more than the others do, along with fruits and vegetables. But looking at the men, and if you remember in the allostatic load variables, the men had more of the stress markers like epinephrine and norepinephrine. And so one of our graduate students is looking at the relationship between epinephrine status and bone mineral density in the men, and found, well, in both, but found no association in women, but a highly significant association in men that was robust, with all kinds of confounders including diabetes status. And so we think this is quite interesting and important. It looks like the diet may be more protective for the women, whereas the men are having bone loss due to these stress markers. Going back to metabolomics, one of the things that we published on early with the Framingham's osteoporosis study, and we found true here as well in the Puerto Rican osteoporosis study, is that fruit and vegetable intake is protective of bone. It's not just calcium and vitamin D, but it's a lot of nutrients working together from a variety of foods, but certainly from fruits and vegetables. So in this analysis, we're looking at metabolomics related to osteoporosis and also related to fruit and vegetable intake. And Kelsey Mangano separated the fruit and vegetables into 6 different categories using principal components to see which ones were most associated. And here, what you can see, very interesting that, sorry, I'll go slower on that. Very different associations by sex. In women, there were markers of tropical fruits and other fruits, lots in berries and melons for both men and women, but different markers, and lots from dark green leafy vegetables, again, for men and women, but different markers. So this needs more exploration, exploration. Okay, so that's where we are. Kind of a whirlwind tour of 30 years, but what's next? Well, we're very excited that we've just recently been funded to look at the microbiome. We think that, all the activity in the microbiome is showing how important it is. And so now we're going to measure that in our sample and relate it to cognition. Also, we're super excited that Jose Ordovas has received an R1 to do epigenetics. As you saw earlier, we saw relationships with DNA damage. We saw a lot of these interactions happening with genetics, but stress directly affects epigenetics. So it's a logical pathway by which some of the stress from discrimination and poverty and fear of crime and all these other things may be affecting the body. And so we're really excited that we're going to be able to take a look at that. These were both just recently funded. In addition, we're part of studies in Puerto Rico. Often when I presented this work over time, people would ask, that's interesting, but how does it compare with Puerto Rico? Well, Puerto Rico has been very understudied. There was a heart health study in the 1970s, and there really hasn't been much since. But Josie Matai, who's now at the Harvard School of Public Health, was funded for the Puerto Rico observational study on psychosocial, environmental, and chronic disease trends. And basically what this study is copying our Puerto Rican health study. Pretty much, we're asking the same things with the same questionnaires to be able to do that comparison. And she's got more than 1,000 people interviewed. And in addition, she's able to bring them into clinics to get more physical measures. Another study that we're involved in is Outlook. And this is funded to the UMass Medical, Milagros Rosal, where she asks, okay, we've got all these problems in the Puerto Ricans age 45 and older. Where do they start? And so she's looking at young adults. She's starting at age 18 to 30 to see how those younger adults compare to the older adults. So we're continuing to keep busy and to unravel these relationships. So with that, I will conclude. And as you can see here, the key contributors are many people, but I want to highlight Jose Ordovas, Tammy Scott, Beth Dawson-Hughes, Alice Lichtenstein, who helped us with the cardio metabolic second program project, Chao Lai and Lawrence Parnell, who have all been active since the start of this project. And at the bottom, I also list Gail Petty, who did lots and lots of our blood analyses. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Tucker, for your presentation. This was amazing to hear this comprehensive background. Wow. Let's jump into questions. Larry Parnell apologizes for not having a functioning microphone, but says, thank you, Katie, for your overview of this important study. With the traditional diet associating with metabolic syndrome, I wonder if you examine the relationships between the main principal components of the diet and acculturation scores.
Yes, and that is related. Certainly, those with the lower acculturation have the more traditional diet, but the relationship with metabolic syndrome remained even after adjusting for acculturation. Good question.
Great. Joel Mason says, Katie, like Larry Parnell, I thank you for all your fine work on this cohort over the past couple of decades. Since low B6 status is associated with several inflammatory markers and adverse clinical outcomes, I wonder whether you have examined riboflavin intake or blood levels since convincing maybe on blood levels, since convincing observations indicate that inadequate flavin cofactor, a common deficiency, leads to inadequate B6 status, and B6 status can be improved simply by supplementing with riboflavin.
Very important point. I've been reading the literature that's come out on that lately. Unfortunately, we don't have riboflavin status, but their intake of dairy is somewhat low, and that is a likely factor that's contributing to this. And we'll see what we can do to look more into it. Thanks, Joel.
All right, Kelly Cara says, in the Chen 2023 study, you mentioned the very low magnesium levels were not found to be associated with diet. Can you clarify which aspect of diet was explored here? Foods like black beans, plantains, avocados, and others that could be in the Puerto Rican diet are high in magnesium. So I was surprised to hear that the magnesium levels were so low and the association was null.
Thank you. I was surprised to see that too. But what we think is happening is that these medications are having a major effect, and it's swamping our ability to see an association with diet. So we don't know how diet on it's own probably is still important and is having other effects on the body. But in terms of the actual magnesium status in the blood, it's just so strong, the association with metformin, that is affecting our ability to see anything else.
Okay. Olivia Grohl says, could you elaborate on the relationship with vitamin B6, B12, and depression in the Puerto Rican adults in terms of the proposed mechanisms? You also mentioned omega-3 fatty acids. Not sure if there was another supplement that was positively correlated with depression. And then there's another, also, was there a gender disparity in terms of depression and its relationship with lack of dietary supplements?
Yes, this really wasn't just dietary supplements. It was intake from foods mainly that were associated. And there's lots of different mechanisms that by which folate, B12, and B6 can affect the brain. One is the same way it affects cardio metabolic syndrome and heart disease. So atherosclerosis and small vessel effects in the brain is one way. B12, in addition, in deficiency, you have demyelination of nerves, and that can contribute to this as well. There's a known relationship between these cardiovascular risk factors and depression. So that's the most likely scenario.
Great. And did you look at any gender differences?
The depression is more common in women than in men, but we haven't analyzed them separately for risk factors.
Okay. Shangdong Wang says, many great work and R01 grants. Thank you. Did you see any association between plasma carotenoids and cognition functions or osteoporosis in your study?
Thanks, John Dong. I didn't present it, but yes, we did. We only had the detailed carotenoids measured for the MAHE study, but in that study, we did see an association between carotenoids and cognitive function. And more recently, we have looked at total carotenoids and cognitive function. We presented it at the nutrition meetings a few years ago, but we haven't written that up. As far as osteoporosis goes, that's a good question. We know that fruit and vegetables are associated, and so we have looked at different vitamins. We've looked at in Framingham, we looked at some of these things, but I think that you are absolutely right. We should take a look at the carotenoids and bone.
Wonderful. Okay, let me see if there's any questions I missed. I think that was our last question. We have one more, so this might be our last question. Alice Lichtenstein says, Katie, amazing to hear the 30-year overview of your work. Congratulations. Can you comment on general trends you observed in your cohort over the years? Are things improving, getting worse, not changing? I would think the ultra processed foods complicate the situation.
Yes. Well, they're getting older. So in general, things are getting worse. We started out with about 35% with diabetes. We're close to 50% now. We started out with 70% with hypertension. It's higher now. But the one thing that's interesting is that the depressive symptomatology has gotten lower over time. And so that was surprising to us. But we checked in the literature, and it seems that there is some precedent for depression being stronger. We think it's stronger during later working years and around retirement time. And after that, there seems to be improvement in depression. It's been seen in many cohorts.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, so that is our last question. So Dr. Tucker, thank you so much for the amazing presentation and also your time today. We really appreciate it. This was, and I'm sure for a lot of our colleagues that you have worked with before, we're very happy to have attended.
So nice to hear from you all. And
all right, so thank you very
you.
much. Yep, and thank you everyone.